And now we're thrilled to welcome Elizabeth Gaffney to the show. Elizabeth's first novel, Metropolis, a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers selection, was published by Random House in 2005. Her second novel, When the World Was Young, was published by Random House in 2014. She won the 2019 Lawrence Prize for fiction. Her short stories have appeared in many literary magazines, and she's been a resident artist at Yaddo, the MacDowell Colony, and the Blue Mountain Center. She also teaches fiction and serves as the editor at large of the literary magazine A Public Space. Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It is a joy and a pleasure to be here with both of you. I love the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is like a class reunion episode for me or something, because I've known both you and our other guest, Wayne Miller, for a really long time. You and I, if I'm remembering right, became friends sort of around our kids, particularly my oldest son and your eldest daughter are roughly the same age. And I remember going on play dates constantly when I was living on the East Coast in 2008, I think. Is that when we met? Was it then?
Well, we met just before that when I was on my first book tour. I remember, I don't mean to say I remember.
Oh,
Gail
that's
more
right.
than
You came in red in Kansas City.
Yeah, Gail and I were both hugely pregnant.
Yeah.
And I was reading at UMKC, which you had so kindly invited me to do, which was a great reading, a really fun, well-attended reading. And I still remember your students were fabulous. And then fortuitously, you had spent a bunch of time on the East Coast after that, and it solidified. Our kids kind of grew up together.
Yeah.
Playgrounds, Princeton, Brooklyn.
I remember a lot of Brooklyn playgrounds. And I remember, of course, your house, which we visited quite a bit with the kids, and certainly Moss remembers all of that. So we don't usually do this in episode when we're talking to writers, talk about them about writing and politics or whatever, but given the topic that we have at hand today, which is about thinking about writing from the point of view of kids, and particularly how that's changed during the pandemic, you want to tell us about your family?
I will a little bit. So my two daughters, Willa and Lucy, and my husband and I all live in a house in Brooklyn, which is, it's kind of about more than just my kids and my family, because I grew up here. And so it's the house is a setting, and the kids, and then my mother didn't grow up here, she grew up elsewhere, but there's shreds of stories that I grabbed from families, but I kind of all situated them here. And for the books that are past time or the things that I'm writing that are contemporary, I'm always kind of grabbing shreds of different childhoods, because I think that's where all of our psychopathology begins, right?
That's great. Yes, very much so. So your 2014 novel, When the World Was Young, is told mostly from the point of view of Wally Baker, this captivating young girl in 1940s Brooklyn. And in this episode, we're talking a lot about how the long isolation of COVID may or may not have changed the way that we think and write about children. And I'm curious about how your novel's shift backward in time might have affected the way that you thought about Wally and her hopes and desires.
I'm glad you asked about time. I do something that it's not such a shocker, but it's always a little counterintuitive to kind of start at the end of something. And there's a way in which my book starts with the spoiler. The main character's mother commits suicide on VJ Day. And so the day that is supposed to be national and global celebration, the end of the war, is a day of personal tragedy. And that was actually drawn from a family story, something that did happen in my family, in my mother's generation. But what I think is that we all have these traumas that shape us. And some people may have grander traumas, deaths. Other people may have smaller traumas. But I feel like, the other day, my 13-year-old was asking me, why do I not remember all the good things about when I was little? Why do I only remember all the bad stuff? And I was like, you know what? Welcome to literature and life. That's what sticks, right? And so to me, I'm actually still interested in this character who's Wally, a young kid in When the World Was Young, and I'm writing her next. I'm writing her next chapter. I'm also interested in going back and writing the story of her mother who commits suicide in this book, and writing her childhood. I'm just super interested in the kind of web of events of our lives, and they're in a way, it's happy ending, sad ending. It's really just where you delimit it. I think we all go through so much, it's like waves and cycles of experience, but the punctuation marks are often the crises and the trauma, and the crucial ones to the way we think are somehow the ones that happen in childhood. So yeah, I've been really drawn to writing about childhood.
Do you consciously think I am writing from the point of view of a child in the 1940s as opposed to a point of view of a child now? Or do you just think I'm writing from the point of view of a child?
Well, I really do think I'm writing from the point of view of a child for the most part, but then there does have to be certain kinds of correction. I try to avoid like ludicrous anachronisms, and so there are certain kinds of diction, certain kinds of cursing or slang or details that need to be right when you're not, and at this point, my childhood is historical fiction, and certainly, my mother's is. And then my previous book, I was writing about, the 1860s and 70s. So that was deeper. And that first book, I had to work so hard never to use the word okay, because God, we say okay all the time, but that wasn't a word. So I didn't want to make her sound like some canned kid off of Father Knows Best and say like, gee willikers, Pa. So I wanted it to sound real, but I also didn't want there to be any howlers for someone who was a kind of a stickler for either the time period or for, I guess, yeah, that line between, you don't want your small child to come out sounding like some peculiar Poindexter who speaks like a highly schooled PhD type character. So there's
like Holden Caulfield. Like a character.
Well, there's special cases. There's always the exception.
Well, so it also strikes me that there are a lot of similarities between the pandemic that we just went through and the period of time that Wally was growing up, even though we were just talking about the differences. While World War II is in full swing, she's separated from her father. Her younger brother dies due to a penicillin shortage during the war. Is it fair to say that, like kids today, she's having to deal with and consider concepts of death and sex and betrayal way earlier than she would have needed to do that in some or other less chaotic time?
I think that is fair to say, but I might even go further and suggest that there's this kind of artificial period here and there in between the wars, maybe the Cold War, maybe I'm not even sure how many years in the 20th century where children are allowed to be innocent and frolicsome, and there are no traumas. The truth is, World War II is preceded not so long before by World War I, and you jump back that early, and medicine is not very able to save many people. That's the era in which, my crazy Irish relatives were still having 10 children because they weren't sure how many of them would survive. And
then you go to work in a factory anyway, right, when you're like 5. I mean, if you go far enough back into the 19th century, you predate child labor laws and things are quite different.
Right, so that little sweet spot where the kids the rights have been instituted, where children are supposed to be children, they're supposed to be educated, they're supposed to be protected from having to work and being exploited, and yet we haven't had all this kind of ugly stuff swoop in. But I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I was a kid, it was 1970s in New York, and I feel like my whole childhood was punctuated with, oh, Mrs. Howard was stabbed in the kidney. Oh, Your friend Trilby's mother was murdered. Oh, you know, there was a lot of disaster. I mean, I was safe and privileged on the one hand, but it wasn't entirely without anxiety and fear. And so I don't know when people are actually safe. I think it's a myth that children are sheltered. I don't think they are.
Well, I wonder if on that note, you would read to us a little bit from the book and we can hear from Wally's point of view.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm going to read from a chapter quite early on. It's chapter 4. And you really just have to know about the fact that Wally and her brother, Georgie, are growing up with two households quite close together because her father is off at war and her mother's living in an apartment near her grandparents, and they spend a lot of time with the grandparents. And the grandparents have an African-American housekeeper, and Wally's best friend, although it's not entirely approved of by all the adults, is the son of the housekeeper. And yeah, I'll just start in. It was soon after Georgie learned to walk that Wally and Ham had first put him in the dumb waiter. He'd agreed to let them do it in exchange for a cookie, not really understanding the terms of the agreement. He didn't mind sitting in the dark box, but he'd screamed and cried when they closed the door and Ham began to turn the crank. "It's heavy with him in there," Ham said. Then Georgie fell silent. Wally's heart ran cold. Had they killed him somehow, accidentally crushed or suffocated or strangled him? But when she ran upstairs to release him, there he was, very much alive, not angry or scared, but smiling. His face bore a look of wonder. He was terribly pleased with himself, proud that neither of the big kids could fit where he had been. He didn't even tattle to Loretta. After that, he'd ridden in the dumbwaiter anytime the grown-ups weren't around. He hid there so reliably during hide and seek, they didn't bother looking elsewhere anymore. When he was grumpy, he took to it for privacy. He'd given Loretta a good fright that way more than once. Wally and Ham still used the dumbwaiter to transport everything from egg creams with vanilla syrup to stacks of comics to contraband ant colonies. It was also a great source of imaginary objects. If ever Wally needed a weapon, say a magic lasso or a gun, she went and looked in the dumbwaiter and came back slapping her hip and letting fly bullets or coils of golden rope. Like a magic lamp, the dumbwaiter always provided, except for the one thing that Wally still somehow dreamed it would contain when she opened the door: Georgie. When Georgie got sick, it seemed like just a cold at first, but it didn't get better, it got worse. Wally had been frightened by the eerie, gasping noises that came from her brother's room. In the middle of the third night, when it reached the point that the whooping wouldn't stop, Stella came to Wally's bedside and shook her, but Wally wasn't sleeping. "Get your shoes on, Wally. I'm going to drop you off at Gigi's, and then I'm taking Georgie to the hospital." Stella walked so fast, Wally had to run to keep up with her. Her grandmother and Loretta met them at the door. There was a taxi out front, and Gigi was wearing her coat. Her mother and grandmother had gone to the hospital with Georgie, and Loretta put Wally to bed in the red and white striped bedroom and sat with her singing Amazing Grace until she ran out of verses, and Wally still wasn't asleep. Wally drifted off at last, very late, to the droning of Loretta's voice telling the only bedtime story she ever told. A story that was always more or less the same, but seemed to have a myriad possible variations and always one to suit the business of the day, whatever the day may have brought, but which, as far as Wally knew, had no end, since she had never hung on long enough to hear it. Once, when the world was young, Loretta began, and this time It took a comic turn, as if Loretta was trying to cheer Wally or herself up. There were no grown-ups anywhere because the world hadn't been there long enough for the first babies to grow up yet. Now, the only problem was the babies had to raise themselves. So naturally, by the time they were young children, like yourself and Georgie, they were already spoiled rotten. They ate whatever they pleased and stayed up late every night, and there was no one to tell them it shouldn't be that way. In the morning, Wally was pleased to wake up in the peaceful quiet of Gigi's house. No crying or whooping to take every shred of attention. It was a rarity for her in those days to spend a night at her grandparents' house. But then her mother did not come home, just Gigi. "Would you like to learn some needlepoint stitches, Wally?" her grandmother asked. "I'm not allowed to use needles, Gigi. I don't think I'm old enough." "Well, needlepoint needles aren't sharp, you know." It was one of the first times Wally could remember seeing her grandmother flustered. "No, thank you. I don't think I'd like it very much. How's Georgie? Is he getting better? Is he coming home today?" "Not today, darling, but soon." When Stella finally came back the following day, Wally ran to her. Her mother did not kneel down to embrace her. She stood limply, her arms crossed against her chest. "Mother, mother," Wally cried, "how is Georgie feeling?" "Go play with him in the kitchen, Wally, or help Loretta. I'll be there in a few minutes." And then her mother walked past Wally and into the living room to confront her own supposedly perfect and powerful physician of a mother who had not been able to pull the strings to get the penicillin that might have saved Georgie's life. "You're the chair of your department," Wally heard her mother shout through the door. "Don't tell me you couldn't requisition enough to treat a child. Just a tiny child, 28 pounds. "I'm an obstetrician, not a god, Stella. I can't requisition what isn't there." "Oh, come on, mother, none? What were you saving your allotment for? Some hussy with the clap who comes into your clinic?" "Get a hold of yourself, Stella. You know they're sending the penicillin to the front, so men like your husband don't have to die for their country. They're filtering the stuff from the soldiers' urine, for Christ's sake, so they can reuse it. So now Georgie died that Rudy might live? Well, I'll tell you which one I would have." "Don't say another word, Stella. There wasn't any medicine there for Georgie, and I am just as sorry as you are, but I won't listen to your accusations any longer." Wally backed away from the door where she'd been listening and crept down to the kitchen in a fog. "Loretta? Loretta, mother said..." Loretta lifted Wally into her arms, breathing in that same salty, sweet child smell that Stella had had at her age too, and Ham, and Georgie.
Thank you. That particular section is so heartbreaking. I feel like Georgie is such a singularly alive little kid. One of my favorite characters. And we
Thanks.
know from very early on that he's one of the great losses that that Wally faces, and the other, of course, being her mother, which you mentioned. And so we was talking about this a little bit earlier, and so were you, that innocence. Wally is obviously not protected in that way. She has a very hard war, and you were saying that the innocence of children can be such an adult invention, and we also see in that scene Ham and Loretta, and the ways in which some kids' parents are not able to protect them from harsh realities, don't have that privilege, and the way in which insulating kids is a way to signal wealth and social status and privilege. And then also just thinking about during that scene, I feel like early on in the pandemic, many people kind of said, if children were getting sick, this whole thing would be handled so differently. And here we see this moment where you see this kind of tender portrayal of like a very loving and friendly sibling relationship. And then you see Wally lose Georgie. And I kind of thought about all the ways that was different from what's going on now. I mean, obviously not for everyone, but then, as we are starting to worry about what's going to happen to kids, the different ways that people are facing up to that. So who gets to kind of be innocent in the United States. And how did you think about that when you were portraying like Loretta and Ham, which is like also one of the central, they're two of the central relationships for Wally?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Who gets to be innocent? I think for sure these kids don't. I think there are moments of naivete of maybe innocence is the bright and shining, we think it's a good thing word for naivete, which is kind of ignorance of things you really ought to know. And we want to protect kids from so much, but unless we put them in a bubble, which we can't, they're not protected for long. And the relationship between Ham and Wally is one that it happens because of a social inequity, right? Ham's mother works for Wally's family as a domestic worker, and yet there's enough flexibility, maybe there's enough lack of supervision in their world that they're allowed to be equal. But also, I was just reading Octavia Butler's Kindred, and there's this great passage in which the main character is in the antebellum South period, and she's talking about how, well, hey, this kid Rufus is friends with this other African-American kid, and later she knows that Rufus will become the slave master, and this kid will become his, an enslaved person on this guy's plantation. And so how space where they can kind of pretend to be equal. And so with Ham and Wally, they are close friends, and yet life treats them very unequally, and they see it together. They encounter situations where he's discriminated against as a brown person, and she's maybe judged for being with him because she's white, but she's allowed in. She's not sent to change in the room, in the mop closet, all these things. So these are young kids, and these are that I think that the time of innocence probably extends about to Georgie, right? When he's still a toddler, an older toddler when he dies. And once you start getting language and connections in the world, if you have eyes or ears or any connections, you're going to see what's not fair in the world. And I do think it's the adult's position to point it out. I think some people gloss over it, but I think it's always there.
So we're in this somewhat rare position of, we don't always get to do this, where we do the interviews for the show back to back and in actual order as they're going to appear on the transcript. So you get to develop, sometimes you learn things while you're doing this. And while you were having that answer and talking about that, I had said earlier when we were talking to Wayne, like that I had been allowed to be a kind of innocent by my parents when I was growing up. But the truth is that I knew about racial division, and I knew about like homophobia, which was omnipresent in my high school. And I'm writing about those things now. And I remember all of those scenes. So I knew about it, but I feel like what my parents were doing was telling me it was okay to ignore it or not take it seriously. That's a difference than real innocence, right? Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's an okay to erase this because it doesn't affect you. I think kids are capable of making that kind of calculation.
Well, that's the one thing, is that, we were talking a minute ago about what are the calculations? Would the pandemic have been managed differently if children were getting sick early? Or what's the calculation of your parents saying, just deal with it, it's not really affecting you, just go along, get along? I think that that what we protect is so, it's so Darwinian. It is literally our own gene line in so many cases, unless we make Herculean efforts to be bigger and wiser and more generous than that. So that, kids are getting sick now to some extent with Delta, right? But even so, people aren't doing much because, is it that lawmaker's kid or this governor's kid? I mean, how old are their kids? I don't know. People seem to make crazy decisions. I do think that like parents, they're going to say, save yourself, grow up and be a good person and take a class in moral philosophy when you're 19. But for now, run like hell. Don't let the bully get you. Let him get somebody else. They just want to protect their own. And I mean, I'm afraid it's very base and survivalist. And, I think all our parents do their best. And they're, I think my parents also sheltered me in some ways, but I grew up in Brooklyn, which was a little different from your experience, Whitney. So
That's for sure.
I was seeing a lot more of a diverse community. And even the part of Brooklyn I live in now has actually become much more gentrified than it was when I grew up here. So
Sugi, I'm curious, you haven't talked about your childhood very much yet. Like you
Block
were
the whole thing out.
No, come on.
yeah,
I mean, it appears in, the events that were happening in Sri Lanka were, I'm sure, you're coming from a family that's coming from a country that's having a civil war, in essence.
Yeah. I think some of my earliest memories were of, reading the news or seeing like printed news that sort of circulated in the diaspora about that, some of which was propaganda. So yeah, I mean,
but how did your parents tell you to think about it, or how did they signal to you like that you should take it very seriously, or that, okay, you've gotten away and you don't have to worry about this anymore, it's not your deal, be an American?
I think we certainly knew about it to some extent, and we did not travel back to Sri Lanka when I was a kid. That was something that I chose to do as an adult. But yeah, I think, it was something that was discussed, like not sort of explained necessarily in great detail. And I think like this is right there's like kind of the an opportunity for parents to shape the narrative significantly when there are not alternative sources for that information.
yeah,
Right. So the parents end up with a really sizable amount of power in how it ends up being portrayed or described, because the kid's not learning about it in school. They're probably not even learning about it on the news. So I think ultimately I was lucky that I had parents who encouraged me to read a lot. And then, of course, I ended up reading a lot about the war and developing a lot of my own opinions about it. I don't think that that's necessarily the case for a lot of other kids in the diaspora, some of whom had their parents as their primary sources of information. And like, it's interesting to see how now, like, there's the internet, you could find other stuff. So, I mean, what do parents do with that power to describe the news? In some ways, like right now, if you lie to your kid and your kid wants to find out that you're lying to them, they can call you on that pretty fast. They don't have to wait until they go to college and find the university library and like read about the historical event that you described. They can call you on it. And I appreciate when the kids that I know find that sort of detail and ask for more information about it, or ask, how do I know? How did I know which things are true? And sort of teaching kids like a critical skill of like, what kind of news source would I actually look at? I don't think that that's something that I had as much as a kid. So, I mean, certainly I was not an innocent, but nor was I the best informed.
Did you have a sense of missing a sort of an extended family community, or other family members who could have been a, sounding board for a different point of view?
Yeah, certainly at some point I have a cousin who emigrated, who's about my age, who emigrated when I was a teenager, and she and I are very close. And she was very influential for me, but also certainly as like a young person, a lot of, if you have a family that's scattered all over the world, it's very expensive to meet all of them. Yeah. And if you are a parent with two kids if you're parents with two kids and you're trying to haul those kids all over the world to meet all the relatives, you can't do it that frequently. So there were definitely relatives I didn't meet, or people I didn't see very much, or extremely long car trips. But it is also true that I can go to many, many countries in Europe and find my first cousins. Now, many of them, I know them really well. And I think many of them had different childhood experiences of innocence. Like some of them were refugees or asylum seekers or just emigrated and then didn't end up going back or what have you. So I think their experiences were, yeah, I think obviously much less sheltered than mine. But yeah, I think like sort of like Wally is such a captivating character to me in part because like she's sort of right at the crux of having things explained to her and figuring them out for herself. Like, and then the sort of the person who might have been the explainer is like gone. And so like sort of remembering myself at that moment, I was like, oh, how did I kind of do that detective work of adulthood?
Yeah, and even when they're there, I think often the adults, as you were describing, they don't say what's unpleasant.
No, right? Like even in that scene that you read, we discover that Georgie is dead through eavesdropping.
Right.
It's like a primary mode of information gathering for children.
Exactly. And one of the things I was interested in with this book, in terms of like children and trauma, is to write a book that was set in a period of war that was not on a front, so that it was kind of the war at home and seeing the repercussions of, you know, on the one hand, some people who die in the war and that affects the world at home, but also, you know, all the disasters that can befall that seem more commonplace or pedestrian in comparison to sort of bombs and guns and those kinds of things. Yeah, because I'm interested in the ways that we all have crises, sort of wherever we are. Almost, you know, if you haven't lived through something absolutely dire, you probably have been very sad, and it might seem unimportant or unmeaningful compared to the devastation of someone who's really lost everything. But to some extent, for a child, the anguish is like it's up to 11, and that's just as high as it goes. You know, you can get to 11 from your pet dying or from losing your entire homeland, and that's pain. That's what kids feel. It's very primal.
Okay, so you published this book in 2014, when the world was young, the one we've been talking about, which is long before COVID, you know, threatened the right of Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene and most of the GOP to be innocent and irresponsible at all times. But I know from our talks that you have written and are sending out a middle grade book that is also about children, as those books tend to be. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So the book is called Can You Hear Me? And I co-wrote it with my friend Andrea Chapin. It's based on one of my daughters who is deaf. She has a cochlear implant, and I was very interested in, well, there's a huge dearth of literature about who she is. She's an auditory deaf person of this generation of kids. She's not a primary signer. She's got some sign language. She's interested in sign language, but it will never be her first language. And I was just looking for texts that would speak to her. And then I'm so interested in the history and past. And so bouncing ideas with my friend one day over a glass of wine, we kind of came up with a storyline, which would be a deaf, because I think I was probably telling her about, there's this great museum in the audiology place where she goes, that's a museum of archaic hearing aid type devices, hearing assistive devices. And, you know, it's just kind of like a few cubbies built into the wall, but it's very cool. Especially if you were a kid with like a cochlear implant and hearing aids and it's kind of techie. You know, they're like these weird trumpets and they're made of sterling silver and leather with tubes, and they're just very organic and strange. So anyway, we came up with a story that's kind of a ghost story about a deaf girl who is actually not allowed to use sign language in the 19th century because there was a time when they were trying to teach deaf people to be auditory and lip read and speak so that they could mainstream them, and that was supposed to be kind. But it was one of these brutal boarding school situations where they were tied up and beaten if they used their hands to speak. And then there's the contemporary kid who struggles with her own kind of hazing and discrimination issues, which my daughter has experienced. So I was interested in not, there's a lot of schism in the deaf community, and I was interested in showing this, like, two sides of it through that veil of history. And also I was interested in channeling the voice of kids, because it's so different from the way you write a child for an adult book. There's, we're using first person for the middle grade. Not that every middle grade book would need to, but it's much more immediate, and we're trying to sort of channel the voices, whereas it's more of a close third when I'm writing about kids in my adult fiction. And I did actually start out writing Wally as a point of view character, and I couldn't jump as easily around the entire universe of my world, which wanted to include adults and people in different places and parts of society. So there's something more intimate for me about the middle grade voice.
So Elizabeth, Whitney tells me that you drafted this book before the pandemic, but you were revising it with your writing partner during the pandemic. And so we have two craft questions about that. I'm curious about whether the pandemic changed the way you thought about or approached these kids as characters. And also, did it change the way you thought about or approached your own children? And are those two things related at all?
It's really interesting. I don't know if it was anything conscious. Like, as the pandemic came in, I had some realization and decided, oh, we should change this. But maybe it was because of the increased intimacy of living with my kids with, like, nobody else, and sort of hearing them and seeing them in isolation. I do think it really changed my understanding of, I guess, my kids' voices. One of the things is that it gave me a chance, maybe more time to spend reading the book. So in particular, my deaf daughter is, she's quite interested and invested in the book. And so she's heard every word of every draft. She has read it on her, iPad. She's the sensitivity reader. She also suggests scenes or says, this is stupid. It doesn't sound like that. She's very helpful. And I got a lot of access to her just because, the rest of life was over. But also, I think around the time of the pandemic, we were doing a draft, and we decided to sort of amp up the point of view of some of the secondary characters. I think maybe it had to do with not wanting the main character to be sort of so isolated a point of view, or trying to create more of a community or a chorus. I think my kids were both struggling with the isolation, and somehow that did lead us to do a little deeper work in terms of character building and voice for the sort of secondary level characters. So now there are more first person point of view characters than there had initially been just two. Well, like the first person present and the first person past, but now there's sort of a peripheral character or two in each time period that also gets a voice.
So Sugi, you want to sign us off there, and then I'll come in with the book titles at the end?
Sure. Elizabeth, I'm so looking forward to reading this middle grade book. I have a young friend with a cochlear implant. I think will be very interested to hear about this. So looking forward to seeing that. And in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us and talking about When the World Was Young. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you guys so much for inviting me. This was a pleasure, and it's really lovely to be in the conversation you guys have been conducting. It's a huge service. Speaking of isolation and pandemics, it's nice to know that the literary community is still there, and you guys are helping that. So thanks.
And speaking of which, we haven't had a chance to mention, along with your books, you have started this new writer space. Can you just say what that is and tell people how to find it real quick?
Oh yeah, really quickly. Thank you for asking. It's called the 24-hour room, and it's a virtual writer space. So it started with just studio space, a Zoom room where people could collect, and it's built and built and built since then. It's online at the 24-hour room, the24hourroom.org, and it's free. If you like it and you use it, it's got a kind of a NPR style pay what you wish if you can pay something element, but basically people come, we have craft talks. We're reading Moby Dick and Octavia Butler at different times every day. Octavia Butler's been all summer. Moby Dick is going to take us 9 months. We read it for like 7 minutes or 10 minutes every morning. And then we sometimes talk about it. Today, we read the chapter, The Gam, and then we had a gam where we talked about it. So periodically we have like a conversation about it. I do put up craft posts based on Moby Dick or other things that come up. People read, we have open mics. It's been a real source. I was very lonely and depressed and needing company on January 6th. And I decided I just came up with this idea. And so by inauguration day, 2 weeks, I learned how to use Google Sites and built the prototype. And it's been going since then. It's pretty fun. We have like 320 people in it. So join, sign up, it's free, tell your friends.
Well, thank you very much. We'll put it in the show notes along with links to your work, When the World Was Young, Metropolis, and all your other good stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Great to see you.